The following Patreon episode is brought to you by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Here to tell you why it's important to become a patron is our favorite guest, Cam Mallow. Cam, why should they become a patron?
It's important to help bring more new episodes.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks, Cam. So if you want to become a patron, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and become one today. We thank you in advance.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to Addressing Gettysburg. And we have with us one of our favorite guests to have on the show, Scott Hartwig. Hello, Scott.
Hello. Good to be here.
It's good to have you, as always. Every once in a while, I go, it's time to have Scott back on, and I'll go scour the internet to see something that you might have written that would be interesting to have you talk about. And I sent you, I forgot what it was, but for some reason, it came up when I searched your name, and it was something somebody else had written, and I sent you a link to it, and I said, would you want to come on and talk about this? You're like, well, I don't really know a lot about that because I didn't write that, you moron. But you did recommend what we're talking about today. It was an article that you wrote for the Park Service blog in October of 2011. It's called The Romances of Gettysburg, Get Those Shoes. And I was so glad to see that you had written something on this topic, because it is one of these things that just plagues us all when you meet someone, especially when they're new to it. And it's nothing against them because it's not their fault, but they'll say, "Oh, I can't believe this was all fought over shoes." But it wasn't all fought over shoes. So explain, what made you decide to write this, and what was it really about? Where does the shoe myth come from?
Well, if you do any casual reading about Gettysburg, even some decent books that have been written about Gettysburg in the past, you will almost always encounter the story that on July the 1st, Henry Heath, who commanded an infantry division, one of the 9 divisions in Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, came to Gettysburg on July the 1st for the purpose of securing a supply of shoes that he had learned were in the town, and that his men needed shoes badly. So he marched to go get those shoes. He was taken completely by surprise that the Union Army was there, and the battle was precipitated. And it wasn't Heath's fault. It was just, they didn't have the intelligence they needed. And the kind of amusing, comical part of this is that for decades, really question. Well, there were some people, but historians didn't question Heath's account. They generally accepted Heath's account of why he came to Gettysburg on July the 1st. So why did they do that? I think part of the reason why people did it, was it's a fun story, and it's an easy way to remember how a huge battle begins. And people love those sort of ironic things. Here we have one of the biggest battles that ever occurs in North America, and it's fought because the Confederates were marching to Gettysburg looking for shoes. It's preposterous. It's fantastic.
Yes.
And if you were one of the very early guides at Gettysburg, what an easy way to explain to people how the battle came on.
Right.
The Confederates were just coming here looking for shoes. Very easy. So I think it was the convenience of this simple story that you could tell. People love simple stories with history, and they didn't want to get into the complications of it. And it came from a veteran, and he was the commander of the division that came here. So why would he possibly not be telling the truth? It wasn't really until Edwin Coddington published the Gettysburg Campaign in 1968, I think was the year that came out. Coddington did question Heath's story, even though Coddington still couldn't even resist inserting the story in there about how he was going to get those shoes on July the 1st.
Right.
So it's kind of like the other famous myth of Gettysburg about the hooves on the equestrian statues on the monuments, and the equestrian monuments in the battlefield. 1 hoof up, he was wounded. 2 hoofs up, he was killed. All 4 down, he made it through the battle okay. That
all 4 up.
All 4 up. There aren't any. So
he was in
find one of them.
all 4 up. He was in the Air Force.
Yeah. So, that's one of those, again, one of those cases where I'm sure early in the guiding period at Gettysburg, if you were a guide, what an easy way to tell people, okay, if you want to remember what happened to these people, if you see one hoof up on the equestrian, that means he was wounded because there's one monument like that, or there's two, or there's one, and then there's one with two hooves up. That was General Reynolds. He was killed, all four down. Those guys made it through the battle. So you tell that story over decades, and people go home and they say, hey, I went to Gettysburg. That's a cool story I learned. Blah, blah, blah. So they tell a story. So the shoe myth is kind of like that. Mm-hmm. It's a easy thing to go home and tell, and then that gets spread around. And once it gets spread and permeates the culture of your history, it's very, very difficult to dispel it because people want to believe
they
that
want
it's
to.
true.
Yeah.
And you're just a revisionist when you question it.
Right.
So,
okay, let's separate fact from myth then. Was there ever any talk about possibly finding shoes in Gettysburg among Heath's in Heath's division or between Heath and Hill or anything?
Yes.
There was. Okay, so that is a fact.
That is a fact.
Okay.
But it wasn't on July the 1st.
Correct. All right, so go ahead. What was it?
It was on June 30th,
right.
The day before. The day before the battle begins, General Heath's division had marched over South Mountain to Cashtown Pass, and they had bivouacked around Cashtown, which is about 8-9 miles west of Gettysburg. And on June 30th, General Heath ordered his largest brigade, which was commanded by General James Pettigrew. It was about almost 3,000 men, to take a bunch of wagons from the division and march to Gettysburg. And they were to search the town for supplies, but particularly Heath had learned that there was some sort of a supply of shoes, and he wanted those shoes. So again, one of the perpetual myths of the Confederate Army is most of these guys didn't wear shoes. That's simply not true. The reason that Heath needed shoes was the same reason that Union division commanders needed shoes for their men. Many of the roads in Maryland and Pennsylvania, the good roads, were macadamized roads. And macadamized roads was crushed stone with packed dirt on top of it. That meant it was an all-weather road. So if you were on the Chambersburg Turnpike, that was a macadamized road. If you were on the Taneytown Road, that was a county road, that was a dirt road, that would turn into a mud pie if it rained a lot. So they don't have that same base. But that base, that rock base with packed dirt on top of it, was very difficult for somebody in bare feet to walk on for any length of time. So your soldiers would become lame, and you needed to get shoes for your men. And the other thing was, for a division commander like Heath, shoes that he's going to obtain in Pennsylvania are going to be better manufactured than anything he's going to get through the Confederate supply system.
Okay.
So he wants to get all the shoes that he possibly can obtain. So Pettigrew is ordered to search for supplies, but particularly for shoes, on June 30th. He is, of course, going to march towards Gettysburg that day. He got warned twice on the way to Gettysburg. One was a Confederate sympathizer from Gettysburg. The other, they said, was a spy in the employ of Longstreet, which could have been Harrison. The spy. We don't know. But both of them warned him that Federal cavalry was approaching Gettysburg from the south. And one of them, it might have been Harrison, told him who it was. He said it was Buford's division of cavalry from the Army of the Potomac. So that put Pettigrew on the alert. Pettigrew halted his division almost 2 miles from Gettysburg, and he advanced with a skirmish line up to the Lutheran Seminary on Seminary Ridge. And when he got to Seminary Ridge, and when he looked to the south or southeast towards the Emmitsburg Road, which comes up to Gettysburg from the south, he saw cavalry coming up, probably the advance guard of Buford's division. So that confirmed for Pettigrew that what he had been warned about was actually coming to pass. There was some type of cavalry approaching Gettysburg. And one of his staff members also believed he heard drums in Gettysburg. And there was a little band that came out to kind of celebrate Buford coming into town. So maybe those were the guys playing the drum. There was no infantry in town. But Pettigrew's staff officer believed that might indicate that there was some infantry. They didn't know, was this militia or was this from the Army of the Potomac? But Pettigrew turned everybody around and he started to march back to Cashtown. And while he was doing so, he stayed near the rear of his column to personally observe the cavalry, which shadowed his movements. And by watching the cavalry, he was convinced that the cavalry was from the Army of the Potomac. They moved like trained soldiers, not like militia.
Okay.
So when he returns to Cashtown and reports to General Heath, his report is going to be, I could not enter Gettysburg because there was a large cavalry force occupied the town, and that cavalry force, I'm quite certain, is from the Army of the Potomac. Now, Pettigrew had served with the Army of Northern Virginia through the 7 days battles.
Okay.
But when the Army of Northern Virginia left the peninsula and they began to move north in the Second Manassas campaign, Pettigrew's brigade did not accompany the Army. And Pettigrew did not serve with the Army until June of 1863, a year later.
Okay.
So he misses Second Manassas, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. So if you're in Heath's shoes, Pettigrew he's just not that experienced, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, he's had combat under his belt. He's not that experienced. He might be exaggerating and seeing things and stuff that really isn't as dangerous as he thinks. So Heath doubted his report, whether he was accurate. He didn't doubt that he might have run into something, but he doubted that it was from the Army of the Potomac. And then when A.P. Hill arrived, the Corps commander, he comes up a little while, probably towards late afternoon, maybe evening of June 30th. Pettigrew is going to give his report to General Hill as well, and General Hill is also going to doubt that Pettigrew saw what he actually saw, which was cavalry from the Army of the Potomac. And Hill tells him that he'd just come from a meeting with Lee, and that Lee's scouts confirmed what A.P. Hill's scouts had already told him, which was the main body of the Army of the Potomac was still down in Maryland, probably about 20 miles from the Pennsylvania line. And they hadn't even taken down their tents yet. So Hill was convinced that if there was anything in Gettysburg, it was just an observation force. And, but of course he felt that they needed to do something about it. So there is this element of truth. Pettigrew does go to Gettysburg on June 30th to search Gettysburg for supplies and also for shoes, and he's not going to find anything because he's going to discover Union cavalry is there. And then that's where the story then begins to get complicated, and the individual who's going to complicate it is Henry Heath.
So who does he talk to? And how does it get complicated? So why is it turning into this? Why is the myth being born here? How does that happen?
It gets complicated because if you follow the timeline of how the shoe myth story begins, it makes much more sense than if you just simply go back to a document and look at it. So in 1877, the Comte de Paris, who was a French nobleman who had actually served as a volunteer aide on the staff of George B. McClellan during the Peninsula Campaign. Comte de Paris was very interested in the war, and he wanted to write a history of the war. And he corresponded he had a lot of contacts, both Union and Confederate. And he carried on an extensive correspondence. So it's important to realize at this point, if you follow the Civil War at all, many people have heard of something called the ORs, which is the official records. It is the War of the Rebellion, compilation of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies in the Civil War. What that is all of the most important correspondence that takes place at the Army level for the most part, sometimes at Corps, maybe division level, but certainly at Army level and also to their central governments. It's all that correspondence for the entire war, and it is all of the after-action reports, because if you were a Union or Confederate Army officer and you were engaged in an operation or an action, You were obligated by law, even though sometimes people didn't do it, you were obligated by law to write an after-action report about that. We call those the official reports. So after a big battle like Gettysburg, everyone who was the surviving commanding officer from regiment, brigade, division, corps, army, battery, everyone was supposed to write a report. Not everybody did, but most people did. All of those reports were then compiled into the official records of the War of the Rebellion. So, for example, the Gettysburg Campaign is volume 27 of the official records. It's 3 parts, and it's over 3,000 pages. So that can give you some idea of the extent of documentation we're talking about.
Yeah.
Those are not going to be published until the late 1880s. All right? So that's an important fact to understand.
And he's talking to the Comte de Paris in the 1870s?
77. He doesn't have access to these reports.
Okay.
He doesn't have access to A.P. Hill's report. He doesn't have access to Henry Heath's report. What he has access to is Henry Heath. He can write Henry Heath. And Henry Heath, and he wants Henry Heath to write an article for him. And Henry Heath is going to write an article about how the Battle of Gettysburg began. So if you were Henry Heath, there was criticism of your management of your division on July the 1st within the Confederate Army after the battle was over.
Okay.
There was a feeling as if Heath had mismanaged the operation and he had allowed Lee to stumble into a battle. So if you're Heath, 1877, post-war Confederacy, you are trying to shape the memory of this battle and your role in it.
Okay.
So what Heath is going to try and do 2 things with this article. The first he's going to do is to make the point that the only reason I went to Gettysburg on July the 1st, was to search the town for shoes. He doesn't say anything about Pettigrew going on June 30th.
Aha.
Right? He actually, I take that back. He does. He mentions Pettigrew went there. He mentions that Pettigrew had seen some cavalry there. He mentions that A.P. Hill kind of discounted the cavalry. And then he says that he commented to A.P. Hill, well, then do you mind if I take my division there tomorrow? Do you have any reservations about that? And he said, A.P. Hill replied, none in the world. Now, when you look at the way military organizations operated in the Civil War, that discussion that Heath mentions is absolutely preposterous. We're talking about one of 9 divisions of Lee's army, 7,000 men operating in enemy territory. Lee's army did not operate that way. There might be some things that would be a little bit casual, but you don't take an entire division and march to Gettysburg to look for supplies. That never is going to happen. It just isn't going to happen. Your corps commander is going to have a plan on what you're doing. So that would be the first red flag. When you see that, you realize that maybe Heath is trying to take any sort of blame off of him because, look, this is all I was doing, and my corps commander approved it. My corps commander, who, by the way, was killed in 1865.
Right, he can't defend himself.
Right? So, and then the second thing that he does in this is he said, I never would have stumbled into the enemy if Jeb Stuart had been doing his job.
Another dead guy.
Right. Says Jeb Stuart, that's the reason. That's why we stumbled into this battle. It never would have happened if Stuart had been there to do his job. So the person who defended Jeb Stuart was John Mosby, the Gray Ghost. Mm-hmm. And Mosby is going to write a rebuttal to what Henry Heath wrote. And he's going to publish it in 1878. He actually wrote to the Southern Historical Society papers, and he also wrote to the Philadelphia Weekly Times, which was the publication that published Heath's article. And the Mosby, despite the fact that he was one of the best warriors in the Confederacy, after the war was over, he became a Republican.
Yeah.
And he was a pariah in much of the South. So the Southern Historical Society papers refused to print his rebuttal, but the Philadelphia Weekly Times did. And in that article, what Mosby said is that, Heath, you're full of hooey. You mismanaged this operation. You skirmished with Buford's cavalry for nearly 2 hours before Reynolds' infantry reached the field. Heath is going to respond to that. And again, it's important to remember when Heath is responding, he's responding knowing full well Jeb Stuart's dead, A.P. Hill's dead, and nobody's after-action reports are publicly available. Mm-hmm. I can write anything I want.
Mm-hmm. Buford's dead too.
I was there.
Yeah.
So Heath is going to respond and say, I never even had so much as any form of a contact with Buford's cavalry. Never ran into him.
Right.
Don't even know what you're talking about. So it's clearly a lie because we're going to know it's a lie because eventually when the official records are published, Heath's report is going to say completely differently than what he's writing to Mosby. So this is kind of how the story gets started.
So, that's a good point. So the official records, does he know, are they being compiled at that time when he's talking to the Comte de Paris, or is this a known thing? Like, what's the story behind the ORs? Like, when does that idea come about? How long?
They would start compiling them in the early 1880s.
Okay.
So when he's corresponding with the Comte de Paris and with John Mosby, that's before he knows that they're going to get the ORs and they're going to actually publish the ORs.
Right. So he's getting away with it as far as he knows right now.
He's getting away with it as far as he knows. Right.
A.P. Hill, though. Well, I guess this would come out more when the ORs come out. When they do come out, we have Heath's report and we have A.P. Hill's report. A.P. Hill characterizes it as a reconnaissance in force, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Based on Pettigrew's report.
Right.
So he's not blindly or carelessly sending that division like Heath is saying that he did or implying that he did.
Right.
He wants to find out, well, is that true? What is in Gettysburg? Let's send the division just in case, right? Is that
right?
That's the reality of it.
Yeah.
Is A.P. Hill.
The reality is that it wasn't a casual, hey, can I take my 7,000 guys, go to Gettysburg and see if I can get those shoes? There was a plan. So the plan also, A.P. Hill mentions in his report that he communicated with Army headquarters.
Right.
So Army
and
headquarters. Right. So there is a definite plan on July the 1st. The plan is Heath's 2 divisions are going to conduct a reconnaissance in force, or Heath and Pender, A.P. Hill's 2 divisions are going to conduct a reconnaissance in force. And A.P. Hill also has the knowledge that Ewell is going to direct the march of he had 2 divisions north of Gettysburg, Early's division and Rhodes. And their orders were to march to Cashtown. Mm-hmm. So the way you would march to Cashtown would be through present-day Biglerville. That would be your best route to go, which is 8 miles north of Gettysburg. But based upon the communication that Ewell has with A.P. Hill, what he's going to do is instead direct Early and Rhodes to march through Gettysburg, then to Cashtown. So what does that mean? Well, if A.P. Hill is coming in from the west, if he runs into a problem and he runs into resistance, it means Early and Rhodes will come in the rear of the enemy because they're coming from the north. They'll come in behind them. And it's I think it was a really good plan. It was a very good plan. It also was 4 of the 9 divisions of the Army are converging on Gettysburg. So again, I cannot imagine that Robert E. Lee did not approve this plan. You can't take that large a part of the Army without the Army commander's knowledge and approval to a position that was forward of where Lee was directing the concentration of the Army. So I think that Lee, like A.P. Hill, they were taking precautions, but they didn't actually see any danger in this movement.
Okay. Yeah, right, because A.P. Hill has intelligence from Lee that it's probably militia, that the Union Army is far away. So this can't be anything big, but let's go see anyway, just in case.
Right.
I just had a question and it slipped my mind. Damn it. So how much of this stuff, Heath has this, well, Stuart wasn't there, my poor boys needed shoes and, all this stuff. And did the Lost Cause religion kind of hone in on that as okay, well, this is something good here because now it can be like these poor shoeless Southern boys are just trying to get something for their tired feet, and Lee was failed by Stuart and everything. And is that another reason why maybe this has become part of the story of Gettysburg? It's been perpetrated through.
I think it's less. I don't know that the Lost Cause enters into this. I think it's more A.P. Hill, or not A.P. Hill. Henry Heath is attempting to shape the memory of how this battle comes on. And he's using the mediums and the lack of knowledge that people have, and the fact that he's one of the only surviving key witnesses. Because also remember, Dorsey Pender is also dead. Mm-hmm. He's going to die of his wounds at Gettysburg.
Right.
So Pender, the other division commander, is gone. A.P. Hill, the corps commander, is gone. Jeb Stuart is gone. Lee is dead by this point.
Yep.
Ewell is gone. There's no one at all who can refute what Henry Heath is saying.
Pettigrew's gone. So yeah, you're right. He's the only one.
Archer's gone. Archer's died. The other brigade commander. I mean, so there literally is no one who is going to be able to refute. Well, there are people who could.
Right.
But Heath also knows that it's unlikely that anyone's going to do that. So if this is really more about, I'm worried about how I'm going to be perceived in history. And I don't want to be perceived as the person who brought on the battle that we lost that maybe changed the course of the history of the Confederate States of America.
Right.
I'd rather Jeb Stuart wears that mantle. Right?
Yeah, sure. So when the ORs come out, does he get any, for lack of a better term, shit for it, or does it just kind of, what goes on with that?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question, because it is possible that he did. I mean, we don't have all of AP, or we don't have all of Henry Heath's papers. He may not even saved everything that he got there. And there's also, the process of going through newspapers in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There's a lot of great material in there, but oh my God, it takes a tremendous amount of time. And it is possible that there were some people who wrote some things about Heath's account that he had published in the Philadelphia Weekly Times in 1877. I mean, it is possible. It's possible that he got some letters from some people. But he stuck to his guns. And in 1892, he's going to publish his memoirs. He needed money at that point. He was also sick. He's going to die, I think, before they were published, of Bright's disease. And so he's not in good health. We don't know what the status of his memory was. Based on his memoirs, it wasn't very good. Whether that was a age or whether that was deliberate, we don't know. But he had. His memoirs are so unreliable that if you're a historian and you're writing about the battle, you really shouldn't use them because they're not. They're clearly Heath attempting to shape how we remember the battle, and he had all sorts of details about it that were completely wrong. He mentioned that he formed his entire division along Willoughby Run, which he didn't do. I forget some of the other things that he had. There
was one about ordering the artillery to bombard Herbst Woods for half an hour.
Yeah, that simply didn't do that. Didn't happen. Right. I mean,
you know what? Now let me ask you about this though, because I just started reading Morning at Willoughby Run. Have you read that? And he mentions that Heath ordered, because Archer, he ordered Archer in, and Archer's like, well, I don't have any supports. Davis isn't up yet. I don't like that. Okay, we'll have the artillery shell the woods over to the right for about a half an hour. And then in the meantime, Davis came up and then they went in. Now, that's the way it is in that book. Is that true? Is that coming from Heath? Are we confusing two different things here, or is that Heath's account of how it worked?
I think that's coming from Heath.
So that's not true.
You don't have the ammunition, if you are a Confederate artillery battery, to shell a suspected position for 30 minutes. You do not have the ammunition to do that.
Okay.
What you're going to do, you may fire some shells at the woods just to see if anything comes out. Mm-hmm. You're not going to fire many. If you don't get a reply, you don't keep firing. So the idea, people are, again, thinking in terms of like World War I or World War II. I mean, you had enough shells, you're going to pulverize the woods, right, and then you're going to move up and see what happens. The other thing is that it's very possible that writing this in 1892, you're Henry Heath. I think he did come back to the battlefield one time. In fact, he identified the tree that he was beside when he got shot in the head during the fighting on July the 1st. He bought this hat that was too big for him, and he wrapped this newspaper in it so the hat would fit his head. And that absorbed it must have been a spent shot, but it knocked him unconscious for almost the rest of the day. And he was still so disabled from the wound. It may have given him a concussion that he couldn't command a division on July the 3rd. That's why Pettigrew commands a division. So he did come back here one time. But did Henry Heath know the difference between Hearp's Woods and the woods on Hare Ridge? I doubt it.
Yeah.
So when he says he shelled the woods, the first resistance that he meets, other than the picket post out on
Knoxland Ridge.
Out west of town, like 5 miles west of town. The first real resistance that he meets is on Hare Ridge, which is Buford's advanced line. That's the first resistance. So it's possible he brought a battery up and shelled the woods on Hare Ridge for a few minutes to see what sort of response that he got. And it's also possible that once they cleared that ridge and came up on Hare Ridge, that they did shell Hearp's Woods, because that would be a likely spot for Federal soldiers Federal cavalrymen to take cover in. And that shelling, that second one, did elicit a response from Caliph's battery, which had two sections around the McPherson farm, north of Hearp's Woods. And then that started a little bit of an artillery exchange, and that kind of helped for Heath develop the enemy position. But it's also possible, when you look at the way Heath commits his division, we can derive some conclusions from what he's doing. He has 4 brigades. He commits 2 brigades. He doesn't keep those 2 brigades in direct support of one another. Those 2 brigades diverge away from the Chambersburg Pike and away from each other. And the reason they diverge away from the pike is it's clear what both of those brigades are attempting to do is outflank the battery that they have been firing at them from near the McPherson farm. These are very standard tactics in the Civil War when you're up against a force that's just harassing you. You simply maneuver around them, they withdraw back to the next position, and you keep maneuvering. There's no heavy fighting. You simply dislodge the enemy by maneuver. It's clear to me what Heath is doing is he thinks he's come up against a force that he can easily handle with 2 brigades. He doesn't even bring his other 2 brigades up, Pettigrew and Brockenbrowse. He only uses those 2 brigades. And he allows those brigades to move in a position that they are mutually unsupporting of one another. They cannot support each other. So when he gets hit by Reynolds' infantry, that's why he gets hammered so hard. He doesn't have any support to those brigades. Those brigades are isolated. They're able to be outflanked, and they're able to be defeated and to suffer very heavy casualties. So it's clear to me that Heath, he mismanaged the advance. And, the conclusion you draw from it, the lesson you learn from it is if you're going to exceed your orders and you're just going to go for it all, take everything you got. Yeah. Don't hold half of it back. Take everything you got, right. Because by holding half of it back, he did have something for his force to rally on, but he probably would not have suffered the defeat that he did had Pettigrew and Brockenbauer been up front, and his brigades been in a mutually supporting position, because he had really good numbers based upon what the Federals could bring on the field. It was that he allowed his troops to be defeated piecemeal because of the way he committed them to this reconnaissance.
So it's management more than anything else.
It's management, and that is where, and I think Heath knew that. He was experienced enough. He knew that. He knew that he had made mistakes, but he was not the sort of individual to go, "Hey, I'm going to hold my hand up and go, I'm going to claim this, and I want history to remember that." I'm like, no, I don't want history to remember that. I want them to remember this was a total surprise. We were just going to Gettysburg for shoes, and if I'd had Jeb Stuart there, none of this would happen.
Right. So is that behind why he denied that he ever encountered Buford's cavalry? Like, that to me was kind of interesting.
He did later admit that he ran into Buford's cavalry. He did admit that. I think in his memoirs, he admits that he ran into Buford's cavalry.
Yeah.
So the other thing about him that also is always a red flag is when somebody starts to change their story. They're not consistent. There's not a consistency to the story. So there are some consistencies between 1877 with Heath and his 1892. But when you look at 1877, the after-action report, which he wrote in September of 1863, and you look at 1892, there are vast discrepancies in those documents. And that's always a red flag.
So it's not even like minor things. It's like huge discrepancies between the different ones.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Glaring discrepancies.
Right. Yes. Because if you read his after-action report, he writes in his after-action report that it became clear to him as he neared Gettysburg that the enemy had infantry, artillery, and cavalry in the area. And the conclusion you draw from that statement is that the dismounted cavalry he may have thought was infantry. He saw cavalry, and he was fired at with artillery. So he believes that all of those branches are in front of him. But he also believes, based upon the way he manages his division, that they're not in any sort of numbers that he can't handle with two brigades.
Okay. What is your favorite aspect of the battle? Like, what do you like to read about or write about most with Gettysburg?
I guess probably the psychological experience of battle.
Okay.
For soldiers.
Yeah.
Rather than some specific place on the battlefield. I find the kind of the John Keegan-esque face of battle to be very interesting to me, and to get at more of how these men actually experienced the battle than how we may want to wish they experienced it, or sometimes, particularly in memoirs and reminiscences, how soldiers often wrote for a popular audience how they wanted people to remember these battles. So I find that interesting. I've always found the opening of the battle to be really fascinating because the decisions that are made are really critical, and they are being made without a great deal of knowledge about where everybody is. Now, the Union Army has a big advantage in this area because a great deal of it has to do with Buford. I mean, Buford assembled a very accurate intelligence picture of the Confederate Army and where they were. So if you were John Reynolds or even John Buford or other Federal commanders, you, one, knew where all of your army was, but you also had a pretty good idea where the entire Confederate Army was. The Confederate commanders did not have that. They had bad intelligence. So you can criticize Jeb Stuart in this campaign. He did hurt the Confederates in that they were having to rely on spies to get information about where the Union Army was, and the intelligence information that they were receiving was outdated and wrong.
What do you say to the argument that Lee It's not that Lee didn't have cavalry; it's that he didn't use the cavalry he had.
What I say to that is, yes, he had some cavalry. He did not have Jeb Stuart, and that makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah.
So you got General Robertson, you got Imboden. You can't count on them to close with the enemy. And also, the other thing about Jeb Stuart that's very important is the statement that Lee makes when he learns Jeb Stuart has been mortally wounded at Yellow Tavern is very telling. He never brought me a false piece of information. So what he's saying is he was a really good intelligence officer.
Yeah.
He was able to sift through all those reports that he's getting and put his finger on what was accurate. So I trusted Jeb Stuart. And that's one of the things that Lee is missing. So if you're A.P. Hill, you're Henry Heath, you're any of these people, you are not aware of how close the Union Army is. And that sets the Confederates up. There's also, another thing that hurts the Confederate Army is there was who wrote this? It was Henry, I just forgot his name. He was a staff officer, Lewis Young. He's a staff officer for Pettigrew.
Okay. Who went up and told.
Right, Lewis Young. And one of the things that Lewis Young writes about is there was this kind of spirit of disbelief that gripped the high command of the Army. They were very confident that wherever they ran into the Yankees, they were going to whip the Yankees. They were just a better army. And they just had this record, and they were on a high, and they were rolling. And he recalled going to General Archer because he'd heard that Archer's brigade was going to lead the march on July the 1st. And he told Archer, he said there was this road that came in from the right. And I think he was probably referring to the Hare Ridge Road.
Yeah.
And he told Archer to be careful about that road because he said that gave the enemy a chance to come in on your flank. And he said Archer just kind of dismissed him, more or less. That, look, you weren't at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg and Antietam, and, we got this.
Yeah.
All right? We're not worried about this. We got this. Although, as far as Archer goes, when Heath orders Archer to move off of Hare Ridge to continue his advance, there is some evidence that Archer questioned the wisdom of moving his brigade forward alone and unsupported.
Yeah.
And Heath basically told him, you got nothing to worry about. You got plenty of manpower to handle anything that's going to be in your front. Go take care of this. And you can see how, you have this, the other thing about these armies that is important to keep in mind is these armies develop a culture. And generally the culture permeates its way down. Sometimes it can come from the bottom up, but oftentimes it comes down from the commander. And the culture of the Army of Northern Virginia is that you are encouraged to be aggressive. You are encouraged to be aggressive, and you have a superior army to the enemy. And don't be stupid, but don't be cautious, because caution gets you into more trouble than being aggressive does.
Okay.
So if you're Henry Heath, you're thinking in terms of, you're not worrying about how's history going to remember me on the morning of July the 1st. You're thinking in terms of, my reputation within the Army, my position within the Army, my future in the Confederate States of America Army. I want to make sure we're going to win a victory here. I'm going to, this is going to bring glory to me and honor to me, and it's going to look good on my resume. And, they're not going to come and thank me for being cautious. So I can handle this. I've got the force to handle it. I'm just going to push these guys out of the way and take this position. And then when the whole thing falls apart very badly, then you got to figure out something. Then you got to figure out some way to explain it. Right?
Yeah. So now you had earlier alluded to this, that while the war's still going on after the battle, there's kind of some rumblings about him, messing it up for them. Is that what you were? Yeah.
We don't have any evidence that anybody wrote anything or said anything about Henry Heath. You can only you derive that from what he writes in 1877.
Okay.
You derive that he's sensitive. There's something there about Heath's management of the battle at Gettysburg, because after these engagements, there's always, particularly when you get defeated, everybody's looking around for what happened. So when you think about the Confederate Army, I mean, people were blaming Ewell, they were blaming Jeb Stuart, they were blaming James Longstreet. There was all this blame that was going around, and everybody had an opinion about why we had lost the Battle of Gettysburg, because most people in the Army of Northern Virginia were clear that they had lost the battle, that the campaign had failed. So, so that's, I think that kind of drives why people, feel the way they do there.
So, do you think, your opinion, do you think that Heath and Hill were being, well, I guess let's say Hill, because he was the one that ordered it. Was he being careless and reckless and, not listening? I mean, the idea that a guy who was just where I want to go comes back and says, there's some troops there, there's something going on, and I don't go and investigate, I guess I do, right? I send the whole division the next day. Mm-hmm. But even though I just came from the top, it's kind of like at Chancellorsville on the right. Like nobody wants to believe these reports that there's a huge force over on the right, because guys on the bottom don't know. It's the guys on the top who know, because they're getting all the information coming in. But the guys on the bottom are actually seeing it. They're saying, "I'm looking right at here it is." Right. Like, I guess the short question is, who do you blame, or do you blame no one, or do you blame Robert E. Lee?
Well, I mean, there's as they say, plenty of blame to go around. I mean, Jeb Stuart does bear some responsibility here, because if Stuart had stayed with the Army and been screening the Federals, number one, would not have been able to gather as accurate information about where the Confederates were as they did. Yeah. And number two, Stuart probably would have identified where major Union Army formations were and kept Lee informed. That's a big game changer if you're Lee. I don't necessarily blame Lee in this, because if you are Army commander and A.P. Hill tells you, hey, here's my plan for tomorrow, here's the report that I've received, here's what I'm going to do, you look at the plan and you're like, based on all my intelligence, there's no real danger of a battle here. The only thing I want to make sure, and I've impressed this upon A.P. Hill really clearly, don't bring on a general engagement, right? Mm-hmm. Don't bring on a general until the whole army is assembled. I want to determine where we're going to fight the battle. You have to believe, again, these people, a lot of this stuff is said, it's not written down. Yeah. You have to believe that A.P. Hill makes it clear to Henry Heath, do not bring on an engagement. If it is enemy cavalry in your path, drive them out of the way. You're relying on Henry Heath's judgment here. You're relying on his judgment. Don't bring on an engagement. Okay, can you open up Hardy's tactics or Casey's tactics and find in there how you don't bring on a general engagement? It's not in the manual, right?
Right.
It's not there.
Right.
So you're relying on the judgment of that division commander. And there is some circumstantial evidence that Heath did get orders. If it's cavalry, drive them out of the way. If it's infantry, halt and report back for orders. I don't know that he actually got that. I have to think that Hill did warn him against bringing on a general engagement. Mm-hmm. So if you're Henry Heath, I get the fact that you've got this culture, you got to be aggressive. You think that the enemy is not that strong in front of you, but here's where I would criticize Heath. You don't know what they have. So you should proceed carefully. You are not supposed to bring on a general engagement. Don't push 2 brigades way out there in front into, enemy territory without knowing what you're getting into. You better bring everybody up, bring your artillery up, bring all your infantry up, keep a really strong force so that if you have to go over to the defensive, it's easy to do, and you can hold your position until Pender's division comes up. So I think that Heath mismanages the opening engagement. And where Heath mismanages it, Reynolds manages it exactly right. And so does Buford.
Buford, yeah.
So it's the combination of, on the Federal side, they manage it really well, and on the Confederate side, they manage it poorly. And then that precipitates this general engagement that once then you become engaged, then, some people will say, well, okay, when A.P. Hill arrived and he came up with Pender's division, well, then they could have just disengaged. Well, then it's a different ballgame now, because now if you're A.P. Hill, you know from prisoners that the First Corps is in front of you. Is there another corps in front of you? If you start to withdraw, you now render everything vulnerable, because you got 4 divisions kind of moving into the area.
Right.
You can't withdraw. You got to fight. You got a battle now. So he's got a battle on his hands. Heath has brought on a battle. The only way you could have avoided the battle is if Heath had disengaged immediately and pulled back to a defensive position, like on Schoolhouse Ridge, farther to the west, and reported back to Hill and let Hill make the decision.
Right. Yeah, you just hold the line and then wait for orders.
Right. But at the same time, I do understand the culture of why Henry Heath attempts an aggressive movement. I think the mistake that he makes is in attempting the aggressive movement with only half of his force is what got him into real trouble.
What do you make of, because you always hear about how as they're marching from Cashtown, Pegram's battalion leads the way. And I think it was, we brought this up on a previous show, and Tim Smith said, yeah, but we think it was probably just a section of guns. What's the story with that? I mean, and the other thing that I believe is to be true is that they led the way until they got to their own skirmish line, and then infantry went up ahead. Is that correct? Am I understanding that right?
I don't think there's any way that Pegram's entire battalion was at the front of the division. I think they very well may have detached because, again, think in terms of you're Henry Heath, you're trying to organize a reconnaissance in force against what you believe is a light observation force. So what do you need to disperse that light observation force? You need skirmishers, and you need a section of artillery, maybe a battery, which is going to be 4 guns, 2 sections, right? That's all you're going to need, because that battery can shell the enemy. If you see the enemy a mile away, you can shell the enemy, and they're going to retreat. They're not going to stay there and get shelled because they're not in. So that then somebody along the line says, it was Pegram's battalion. Well, it wasn't Pegram's battalion. It was a battery of Pegram's battalion that may have been behind the skirmish line. They're not going to be in front of the skirmish line. Was behind the skirmish line. That makes complete sense to me because of the nature of the operation. If they thought that they were going to run into some real serious resistance, those batteries would have been behind the infantry.
So
maybe sandwiched in the middle of the infantry.
Right. Like put a unit up front. I always kind of took that to be an attempt at whoever's pointing it out to illustrate how careless Heath was being.
I think, and I don't think Heath was being careless in that respect because, one of the other things about the opening of the Battle of Gettysburg, and this has been dramatically shaped in people's minds by the movie Gettysburg. They imagine that the engagement between Buford and Heath was this pitched battle like the Alamo, right? Yeah. Whereas the reality is the guy who commanded the skirmish line, Burkett Fry, who was a colonel of the 13th Alabama. Burkett Fry wrote a letter to John Batchelder, I think in the late 1870s. And he said in the letter that the resistance that they received from the cavalry was inconsequential.
Yeah.
He said, we just pushed them right out of the way. It was really easy, which is exactly what the cavalry was supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all they're doing is harassing you. They're not going to stand and fight and die. And the only place that the cavalry starts to put up any beginning real resistance is along Hare Ridge. But even there, the numbers that are coming at them, they're not going to stand and fight. I mean, because if you're a cavalryman, even if you're the commander of that skirmish line, what are your orders? What have they told you? Has somebody come up and told you that, guess what, we're going to fight the biggest battle of the Civil War here? No, nobody has told you. So you're just operating on resist them. Don't lose many men. Right. So the Buford's division on July the 1st loses, I think, 112 killed, wounded, and captured, the whole division.
Yeah.
The majority of those casualties all occur in the afternoon of July the 1st when they are fighting Colonel Abner Perrin's brigade. That's when they're fighting in positions south of the Hagerstown Road. They get into a real fight there against two regiments of Perrin's brigade, and that's where Buford's cavalry suffers most of its casualties. They suffered very, very few casualties in the morning engagement. Literally a handful of casualties. And the same thing with the Confederates. They suffered very few losses as well. So that all tended to reinforce the idea, if you were Burkett Fry or you were Henry Heath or any of these other guys, there's nothing in front of us that we can't handle.
But now Burkett Fry says it was inconsequential, but it did take him an hour and a half, 2 hours to actually get to McPherson's Ridge.
It did. I mean, the thing is, the thing to keep in mind is that, your skirmishers aren't running forward. Your skirmishers are moving cautiously, right, carefully. They're probing in buildings. They're going over fences through cornfields and wheat fields and through woods. And there's evidence from Pettigrew's brigade that at one point during the advance on the Chambersburg Pike, that Buford sent a mounted regiment around to threaten the flank of the marching column. And it's very possible he did this. What he did is he sent a mounted force out, and it could have just been part of the 8th Illinois Cavalry. Mm-hmm. But it was a feint. It was just a feint. But Pettigrew actually halted his brigade and deployed an entire regiment off to the flank. Well, you think about the time it takes.
Yeah.
Halt your men. Deploy an entire regiment, have them march out a little ways, watch the cavalry ride off, and then you're like, oh, you know what? We need to put more flankers out. So you can only move as fast as the flankers. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of reasons. I don't fault Heath for how long it took to march from Cashtown to Hare Ridge. I think that without any cavalry, he had to make that movement really carefully, and he was really careful. Well,
and that's what was so good about Buford's plan, was he knew it would take long for them to get online and all this other stuff. So and it was and the terrain worked out in his favor too.
Yes.
And it was great. All right. The name of the article is Romances of Gettysburg. Get those shoes. It's a 2-parter. I'll leave the link in the description, but if you don't click on that, just go and Google it. It's as always, it's a very interesting read, and it really, I love busting myths, because some myths, they annoy me. I feel like I'm being played a fool for believing a myth, So I love when somebody comes along and busts it, and I'm like, yeah, now I feel like I'm armed with knowledge or something. So this was interesting to do. Scott, thank you very much. Now that you're all vaccinated, maybe next time you can come into the studio and check it out. It's well, I wouldn't say it's better than the studio you were at last time, but it's you would say that, Eric? I would. Well, because we worked really hard at drywall, but it's a studio. It's something. Oh, yeah. So, come on in.
Yeah, I'm vaccinated now. I'll definitely come in there next time.
Yeah, very good. It was great talking to you again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening. All right, thanks a lot, Scott.
Yep, Matt.
I appreciate it.